Okay. So the cell and the membrane of the cell. But I think before we go into the cell, you have to understand the organizations. I don't know if I went through this with you or if your lecture instructor went through this with you yet. I could put a recording on, but let's talk about this. So you have levels of organization even before life or before the level of living things. Like, did you ever hear of subatomic particles? Please participate if you can.
Heard the word before.
Yeah, so you know there's going to be an atom. Like the next thing's going to be an atom. So subatomic particles would be the lowest in our interest. We call them particles because they're not cells, they're not atoms. And there's three main ones within these atoms. The positive, what do we call that? The positive particle that stays kind of within the middle of what we call the nucleus of the atom, not the nucleus of the cell. Anybody know what that's called? It begins with a pro, ends with a ton.
Proton.
Proton, yeah, proton. And that has mass, which means it's kind of its weight, takes up space, kind of like me. And then there's a neutron, which has no charge. So every atom has these, proton and neutron. In fact, the atomic number of an atom is the number of protons. And the weight is adding up these two protons and neutrons that are in that atom. And it varies based on the number, the atomic number, which again, we don't do chemistry, but you got to understand these things. So I'm interested in those, proton, neutron, but what's the other one? What's the negative one called? This is the particle that likes to party.
Electron?
Electron. This is the one we really got to talk about because this is the one that's in the outer shell of the atom and it loves to bond with other atoms. So the electron creates energy. You know the idea of being polar. You know the Earth, right? It's got a North Pole and a South Pole. And it really means they're complete opposite ends. And that creates a polarity. And it could be an electromagnetic polarity between positive and negative. Did you ever hear that? Like magnetism, like the opposites attract and there's energy there. And if you don't, just imagine, play along. Because they do, there's a lot of energy between charges in this magnetic field of ours. So each little tiny little particle has that electric charge within its nucleus. It's not even a cell yet. Crazy stuff. So the polarity is opposites. And I mean, that's pretty good. There's a lot of like energy within that, but to get them to depolarize and mix, now that creates a hell of a lot of energy and excitement. So, because we're going to talk about, you're going to talk about the nervous system in lecture, but you got to understand it because we're going to talk about the cell membrane and how this may come into play. Anybody know the four main elements or atoms in your body?
Sodium.
Yeah, sodium's in there, but it's not so big. What's a really big one? Carbon, thank you. Carbon, yeah, that's a big one. And carbon is what makes things organic, believe it or not. What's another one? Like what's in water? H2O. What's the elements in water?
Hydrogen and oxygen.
Hydrogen and oxygen. Excellent. And then there's one more. Begins with an I, ends with a Trojan. Nitrogen. So these are the main atoms in our body, 98%. So yeah, you have other atoms. And I like to call this CHON. So it helps you remember CHON, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. But you have, like he said, really important ions like sodium. It's weird because there's no S there, but sodium used to be called natrium. And then there's this one here. Anybody know what K stands for?
Potassium.
Potassium, cool. And then there's Ca. Anybody know what that is? This is what you get from like milk and calcium. Cool. And there's other little ones like magnesium, chlorine, And then this one is kind of important too. Fe. Anybody know what that is? That's a tough one. Iron. Very good. Because that's really called ferritin, and potassium is kalima. So Really good. That was really good. So every once in a while, these actual elements or ions, they'll lose or gain one of these electrons. And then they really like to party. Like a sodium ion or sodium atom tends to lose electrons because of the number of electrons it has, which you don't have to know. We're not doing chemistry. But look at this. Are you with me on this? So now it becomes an ion. And now it really wants to gain an electron. So this guy over here, chloride, you ever hear of chloride? And if you put them together, you get what's called like sodium chloride. And that's a molecule, though. It's not an atom. That's salt. You've heard of sodium chloride. Like you hear the word sodium a lot. So chloride or chlorine tends to gain electrons, and sodium tends to lose electrons. So they get this ionic form because of the electron change. And calcium too. And the rest of them are going to be positive. Potassium tends to be positive, losing an electron. Calcium tends to lose 2 electrons. Magnesium tends to lose 2 electrons. Iron tends to lose 2 electrons. So it becomes positive. Now, what about this guy here? This is the smallest element or atom. Anybody know what the atomic number of hydrogen is?
1.
It's just 1. So that's the simplest. And that's the one I'm going to talk about. Not a lot, but a little bit. So that means it only has 1 proton. And if it has 1 proton, it usually has 1 neutron and 1 electron. So basically, hydrogen only has 1 electron. So if it loses the electron goes bye-bye, you're left with this. And that's the hydrogen ion, which is really important with acid and things. This is what acid is, right? You've heard of pH, percent of hydrogen. Cool. So just know that these ions really create electricity too, right? Energy. Remember this polarity thing I was telling you about the Earth, right? You have the North Pole with the big fat guy with the red suit, and then you have the South Pole, right? And that's polarity. I don't know if I can even explain that so good. Polarity. It's like an opposite that creates a lot of potential energy. And when you mix the two, when you depolarize, that's when the action happens. So cool. So if we put atoms together, what do we get? Like 2 hydrogens and an oxygen, or sodium chloride, like I showed you, or something like this. What do we call that? What do we call those things? Begins with an N, M, ends in a Q. I'm going to say the word molecule more than I will atom. So molecule is atoms or elements bound together. Like water is 2 H's, 2 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen. Now remember, this oxygen is not the oxygen we breathe. The oxygen we breathe is 2 molecular oxygen gas. Like CO2 is the gas we breathe out, that molecule. So oxygen is a molecule, and the rest are compound molecules, meaning they have more than 1 element within it. Could you all understand that? Any questions on this?
But wouldn't oxygen with the 2,
What about it?
wouldn't that be an atom?
I can't.
No, O2 is a molecule. The the element is just an O. It's a good question.
Oh, okay. All right.
Oh, right? You said O.
I have a question.
Sure.
I have a question, right? I mean, so you know, like how you said, when the compounds kind of, when the elements tend to come together, they tend to lose and gain an electron.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, but like right here where it's written, like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, like it's not negative, positive.
No,
It's
they're stable, right?
Yes,
They have the stable amount. They have an equal number of protons, neutrons, and electrons, which is the way they like it. But once one loses and gains, then it turns into an ion, and then it's more electric. That's all I need you to know, because again, we're not doing chemistry. But excellent question.
Wait, so in what cases would they tend to borrow or like gain or lose an electron?
Most of the time when they're dispersed in water, Good question. Another good question.
Also,
Like- Yeah, yeah. So again, we're not doing chemistry. I could
Oh.
spend a lot of time on that, but I just need
All
you
right.
to know that they can be ions, and they can lack an electron or gain an electron, and then create polarity. That's really the concept, because it's really difficult, the cell membrane, how it works. Do you get that polarity effect? And that's not easy. That's the whole thing. And I'm gonna explain it, because again, I couldn't let you go on your own on this one. This is a tough lab to understand. So now we got molecules. Now here's some more memorization you need to do. There's actually 4 organic macromolecules.
Wait, so the
That just means
molecules are
big
the ones
ones.
that can be ions and create polarity, right?
Atoms can do that too, though. It doesn't have to just be
Okay,
molecules. But
atoms
yes,
and-
molecules can.
Okay,
But
thank you.
here's the idea. There's 4 main organic macromolecules. Now what's organic mean? Which element did I say is important for it to be organic?
hydrogen.
Carbon?
Carbon, yeah.
Carbon.
And carbon
Oh.
makes it organic. But look at the CO, you see the CO2? It has carbon, but this is an exception. This is not organic. This thing right here, you see the C6H12O6? That's very organic, because it has CHNO, especially C. So C6H12O6 is a carbohydrate. That's glucose, extremely organic. So let me tell you what the 4 organic macromolecules are. Let's say we go to, and you eat 3 of these all the time, like they're your nutrients, because our bodies are made up of these. You are what you eat, right? Let's say we go to Popeyes, right? Chicken. And we eat French fries and the biscuit. What nutrient is the biscuit? Which contains some sugar too.
Carbohydrates.
Yeah, that's very good. Very excellent. So carbohydrates. And what is the chicken part, like the meat?
The protein.
That's the protein. Very good. Protein. So these are long, macro means big, and they contain long chains of carbon and always hydrogen too, and oxygen. Very good. And what about the little yellow stuff underneath the skin of the chicken?
Fat.
Yeah, that's triglycerides or fat, but we call fats and steroids, we call that lipids. Cool. So those are the 3 macromolecules that are made in our body and used in our body.
But you said there's 4.
That we could eat. But the 4th one, we do eat, but it doesn't really make sense. So the 4th one is mostly about our genetic material. And what is our genetic material? Like, what is that? DNA, RNA, right? Deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. So the Na is the 4th one. That's nucleic acids. Long carbon containing. And these have nitrogen too. So do proteins. So nucleic acids. And nucleic acids are important to know 3 of them. There's 3 nucleic acids that you need to know before we move on. One, you already told me, DNA, which stays in our nucleus only, never leaves the nucleus of the cell. RNA, which does leave, helps build proteins. And then you have, this one's tough. I don't know if I mentioned this before. What's the energy source of our body? The 3 letters that.
ATP.
ATP, very good. So ATP is a nucleic acid. So ATP is really important in our body. This is something we need to have and has to be made to give us energy, give our cells energy to do everything, especially move things in and out of a membrane. So this organic macromolecule is really important. Now, here's another term. Lipids, right? Do you ever mix, like say you mix oil, which is a lipid, with water? Do you ever try that or see that? It doesn't mix very well, right? Water and oil doesn't mix, like fat and water doesn't mix. So carbohydrates and protein love water. They love water. They'll mix in there easily. And we call that hydrophobic. hydrophilic. Break that word down. Hydro means water, philic means to love. Now, lipids are what's called hydrophobic. That means fear. Phobic means fear, but it doesn't mix. It's literally
So
not afraid.
hydrophobic is like it's not resistant like to water, and hydrophilic it is resistant to water.
What do you mean resistant? I'm confused.
Like I meant like interact, sorry.
Well, let's say this. If in our cell membrane, right? Cell membrane is like an outer, it's a barrier, but it's very special, which we're going to get very much into in a minute or two or three. So if our membranes are both hydrophilic and hydrophobic, meaning they have substances that like water and they have substances that fear water, but it's mostly lipid. So a lipid is going to get into that membrane easier than something that's like a protein that's hydrophilic, but lipophobic, fears lipids. So it mixes better. If something's hydrophilic, it's going to mix better in water, but it's not going to mix better in lipid.
Yeah, that's what I meant, like mix. I
think
couldn't
that's
find
what
the
you meant,
right
yeah.
word for
Yeah.
yeah. All right.
Yeah. So listen to this. Here's a practical thing. As we kind of talk about this, like, what's the hormone that's very anabolic that's released from the testes in the male? What's the male hormone that you always think about?
Testosterone.
Testosterone, right? Good.
Yeah.
And what's the hormone that's released from our pituitary gland that's important for growth? And the hormone says growth. It's growth hormone, right? You kind of follow me? There's two different hormones that kind of do the same thing. They're very anabolic. They build proteins. They build muscle. You follow me?
Yeah.
So what these proteins have to do, and you're going to see that in a couple of minutes, they have not proteins, these hormones have to do. They have to go into the cell and build proteins. That's what anabolic means. Build muscle, build bone, build organs, build structure, protein, right? So testosterone is a steroid, which is a lipid. So that comes right into the cell. No bouncer, no nothing. Comes right in easily, blends right in. It's lipophilic, which means it likes fat, but it's hydrophobic. Now, let's say that the growth hormone is a protein. The protein is going to have a harder time getting into that membrane because it's hydrophilic and lipophobic. So it's not going to mix well. So it's going to need help getting into the cell. And it's going to need energy to get into the cell or out of the cell to do its job. So lipids versus water, or you might hear the word water soluble. Maybe that makes more sense to you. Water soluble. Sometimes we use that term. And I got to mention another term, that hopefully not to confuse you. But if it's hydrophilic, then it's polar. So remember, loving water is polar. Means they have a nice opposite structure. Hydrophobic is non-polar. So here's the question. I know this is difficult. Lipids are hydrophobic and non-polar. Carbohydrates and proteins are hydrophilic, and they're also lipophobic. And you could use a word like the lipids, of course, all lipids like testosterone or estrogen are lipid soluble. Means they blend right in. These are non-lipid soluble. And they're polar. These are non-polar. This is going to be really important when we talk about this membrane. I can't not tell you this stuff because you wouldn't understand it. Okay, Just to go back to carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, just you want to be straight to what we need these things for. What do we need carbohydrates for, like glucose? What do we use them for?
Energy.
Yeah, we use them to make ATP. We want to use glucose, which is a monosaccharide. It's the simplest of carbohydrates, to make ATP. That's the number one thing we want to do with carbohydrates. There is nothing else we want to do with them. Protein, we do not want to use for energy. Proteins are our structure. Protein makes up our bones, the collagen and the connective tissue, the proteins in muscle, like in Popeyes, the meat. That's the structure, right? We don't want to use them for energy. We could if we have to. And what's the breakdown particles or products of protein? If I broke a big protein down, what is its building blocks called? What kind of acids is that?
Amino acids.
Amino acids, very good. So the breakdown products of carbohydrates are monosaccharides, like glucose. And you should remember glucose, and this is what it looks like here. And it's very hydrophilic, it's polar, and it's non-lipid soluble. So much stuff. Okay, lipids break down like triglycerides are a type of lipid. And that's our storage form of energy in our body. You know that yellow tissue, you'll look at that next time. I don't know, maybe 2 labs. So adipose tissue stores triglycerides, your fat cells, all right, for stored energy. And they do more. They actually release hormones. It's not that simple. And then there's steroids, are lipids. And listen to this, all steroids are made from a molecule called cholesterol. So cholesterol is a lipid. And it's a base for all steroids, including testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, which is another female hormone, and cortisol, which is an adrenal gland hormone. Aldosterone, you're going to hear these words as you go. So I think it's easier to talk about testosterone and estrogen because we kind of understand that. So lipids are stored energy, and steroids, that could be hormones, and they have other functions in the cell, which you'll see. Nucleic acids are 3 reasons. One is the DNA, that's our template that we have handed down from generation to generation, stays in the nucleus. Remember this, DNA never leaves the nucleus of the cell. RNA is a copy, basically makes a copy of DNA and takes it out to a ribosome to build proteins. So we'll talk about the cell a bit, and ribosomes are the site of protein synthesis outside of the nucleus. Another nucleic acid is adenosine triphosphate, and that's a nucleic acid that is used for potential energy. So we have to break down that nucleic acid to give off energy to run our cellular metabolism and to help things in and out of cell membranes, because sometimes it doesn't happen. And you're going to do your labs, you're going to see that there's polarity. You're going to see that high concentrations of something going to a low concentration is going to not need energy. The word diffusion means free, no charge. You come right in because there's a lot outside and there's a little inside. It goes downhill. But to go the opposite way, uphill, against the gradient, that's going to cost you. And that's going to cost you ATP every time. And this is going on. Right now, we're sitting here for 45 minutes, and this has been going on over and over and over. Things going in and out of our cells, proteins being built, proteins being broken down, carbohydrates being used to make ATP, ATP being used for muscle contraction for us to talk and move and type, and so forth, so on. So that's really that's a topic we got to cover soon. So where are we? We're at number 4 already. Hello, what's up?
I'm sorry, how do you spell it? Dennis, you said there's a
adenosine, which is actually a nitrogenous base. That's the A, and then triphosphate. So it's 3 phosphates. Phosphates you're going to find out are very polar. Phosphate.
And adenosine and triphosphate, those are just names for ATP, right?
That's it, yeah. Adenosine, and that's why it's a nucleic acid, because adenosine is part of a nitrogenous base, and there's a sugar in there and 3 phosphates. So a nucleotide is, which I didn't mention, a nucleotide is a breakdown product of nucleic acids. Nucleotides have a base. I don't know if you remember ATCG, adenine, cytosine, thymine, guanine. You're not going to have to know that right now, but that makes up a nucleic acid. Then there's a sugar, which is always ribose. And then there's the phosphate. In this case, there's 3 phosphates bound to that nitrogenous base. So yeah.
I also have one more question. Like for carbohydrates, you mentioned use like glucose for energy.
Mhm.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good, excellent point. Excellent point.
And
And,
diffusion. Can you go
and
over-
it's polar, and it's lipid, a non-lipid soluble, and of course it's hydrophilic, loves water. So number 4, what are these little things? Like you've probably seen a cell before, you're gonna see it soon. But there's a nucleus in a cell, there's like ribosomes, there's rough endoplasmic reticulum, smooth endoplasmic reticulum, there's Golgi apparatus, there's mitochondria, which is one of my favorite things, centrosome, lysosome, all these things. What do we call them? They're cute little organs. What do we call those things within the cell?
Organelles.
Excellent. Organelles. So that's the next level. So we go from subatomic to atom to molecules. That's all chemical stuff. But now we're getting into stuff that's a little outside of the chemical. Now we're getting into more anatomy, physiology. And 5 is the cell. And we're going to talk a bit about the cell and the cell membrane, of course, today. And cell division, like how a cell undergoes nuclear division and makes a brand new identical copy. And what's that word for somatic cell division? Begins with an M, ends in an osis.
Mitosis.
Mitosis, good. You said mitosis, not meiosis. Because meiosis is just sex cells, gametes, like the sperm cell and the egg, oocyte. So all other cells besides those undergo mitosis for cellular division. And it's crazy how that happens over and over. DNA replicating. It's a miracle, really. So the cell we're going to talk a lot about. And then we're going to move on later after the cell, next week or the week after. So if you put all cells together, like cells that have common function together, what do we call that? Anybody know? Begins with a T and ends in a shoe.
Tissue.
Tissue.
Tissues, right? Tissues. So now you got to memorize something else here. Let's memorize this right now. There's 4 basic tissue types. Anybody know?
Isn't
Any
one
of-
of them epithelial?
Yeah, excellent. That's a good one. And that's the first one we do. Epithelial. So this is kind of like the classic cells that have the nucleus and all the fun parts. And epithelial tissue basically lines tubes in our body, lines membranes, and our glands are made of epithelial, like our sweat glands, our adrenal gland, our pancreas, and the tissue that lines the outside. Very cool. What's another one? What's another basic tissue type?
Muscular.
Connective. Yeah, that's probably the one we'll do after that. Connective. This is a complicated one. This has different types of connective tissue, the most varied type of tissue, but the most abundant tissue in our body. And there's a lot of protein in connective tissue. Because remember, proteins are structure. You're going to hear a term, a protein called collagen. That's a protein. Collagen is the most abundant protein in our body, collagen, because there's so much connective tissue. Excellent. What's another tissue? And we're going to talk about all 4 of these this semester.
Muscular.
Muscle, great, muscle tissue. And there's 3 types of muscle. We're going to really do a lot of skeletal muscle this semester, which is the muscle that we know that moves bones and moves us around and helps us voluntarily, like we can control skeletal muscle. It's called voluntary. And then your heart is a different type of muscle completely. It looks the same, kind of, not really, but you have to be able to tell me what it looks like under a microscope. So skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is the second one. The third one is called smooth muscle. And smooth muscle and cardiac muscle are both involuntary, thank God. So smooth muscle is completely different. And smooth muscle is also called visceral. Viscera means organ. So smooth muscle is what's in our blood vessels that makes them constrict. Right? Smooth muscles are in our digestive tubes that keep moving the Popeyes down all the way from the esophagus all the way to the anus. So smooth muscle controls that. Smooth muscle controls movement of sperm through the ejaculatory duct, the oocyte through the fallopian tube. So smooth muscle is involuntary. Thank God. Thank God. So 3 types of muscle. And what's the last one, which we're going to do a lot at the end of the semester?
Nervous.
Nervous, really good. So nervous tissue controls everything. You probably heard about this in lab lecture, talking about feedback mechanisms. And usually the muscle is the effector, and the nervous system, like the brain, is the control center. Outstanding. That was really good. You guys are really on top of that game. So what's number 7? If we put tissues together, what do we have? Like the heart and the stomach and the brain. What are those things?
Organs.
Those are organs. Really good. So the skin too, the integument is an organ. That's your first organ system, which of course is coming next. Organ system. So your skin or integument has all 4 tissue types. It's not just epithelial. Like everybody always answers this the same. Like I say, what type of tissue is in the integument? And it's a trick question, because everybody's going to say skin is epithelial tissue, but it's only partly epithelial tissue. Skin, integument, has all 4 tissue types. And you're going to see that in chapter 5, I think. So organs are a group of all 4 tissues, basic tissue types. And then you put different organs together, you get organ systems. Now we do nervous system, we do reproductive system, and endocrine system in this lecture. Not that I'm teaching you lecture, but it goes along with the lab a little bit, a lot of it. Skeletal system, we'll be just naming bones in lab, but you'll be learning what you should be learning now about the skeletal system. And then muscle system, but we're just be naming muscles. So what comes after organ systems?
Organism.
The organism, that's us. Right? Organism, right? And that is us. And this is human anatomy and physiology. Let me draw some hair on myself there. Looks cool. Okay? So I think, again, this is being recorded, so go back and listen to this. I could put up another recording from the lecture, but you're getting this intro A&P in lecture, correct?
Yeah.
You kind of got this. It's chapter 1. I think I might have mentioned this is A&P 1. Thank God I remembered this is A&P 1. So you're going to have to read chapter 1 in one way or another to really get this all down. You know, I think that's one chapter everyone should read. Cool. So that's a good start. Again, I know this is a really long presentation, but this has to be done in the next couple of lectures or labs, I should say. So let's just go through some cells. We talked about microscopy. You know, the gross anatomy is what you can see with your naked eye, and histology is what we're looking at when we look at tissue. So histology is the study of tissue. Cytology is the study of just one cell, but we really don't do that. We're looking at multiple cells. By the way, I just wanted to bring up, when we're talking about histology and cytology and histology, these 4 tissue types, epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous, where does bone fit in? Bone, like bone tissue. Like I could say bone tissue, but bone is not a basic tissue type. It falls within one of these 4. It's connective. Bone is connective tissue. It's derived from the same embryological start. It also, by definition, is connective tissue. And adipose is also connective tissue. Adipose, the fat, remember, the triglycerides are stored in adipose tissue, the yellow stuff at Popeyes. And blood is a connective tissue. The cells, the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets within plasma, all blood, that liquid with cells is connective tissue. And you'll see that when we do tissues. So we're studying histology and we're using the microscope. Again, we're using virtual labs is what we're doing because we're being safe and staying home, not going into lab. So again, there's a size of cells. Cells have different size. I'm not going to split hairs on the size of cells, but you're going to have to know what they look like, the shape, and the special features, right? Well, I'll show you a cell that has all the features, like a Mercedes-Benz that has all the options. Then you're going to look at the membranes within the cell and the organelles that are bound by membranes, like the nucleus and the mitochondria and the Golgi apparatus and smooth endoplasmic reticulum, rough endoplasmic reticulum. And then inclusions, like a ribosome, we'll look at that. That's not membrane bound, but has great function. So you really have to go through the cell to look at it, right? Again, cytology, study of cells, but we're talking more histology, study of tissue in our class. And we learned about microscopy. You did all the work, did a great job. We use a light microscope. We're not using electron microscopes. I might have mentioned if you look at something like DNA close up to really see what DNA looks like, and specific for you, you use stronger microscopes. But we use the light microscope, compound microscope with those objective lenses that you learned. So when you look at cells, you're going to have different structures. Like this is just an example what you see in light microscopy of a cell of an epithelial tissue. And the cells have, and you're not going to have to know this, well, you will have to know this exact one when you do tissue, but look at like these dark staining things are most likely the nucleus of cells. And they pile up, and the cells have these accessory parts called cilia sometimes. And just take a look at this. We're not going to see this stuff because this is electron microscopy. We're just looking at the light microscope, which we can get up to 1000x at most on our microscopes. Okay, and size of cells, like an erythrocyte is another name. Erythro means red, so this is a red blood cell. Anybody know what's different about a red blood cell cytology-wise? Like an epithelial cell, let's say, just looks like this. A red blood cell looks like this. What's the difference? What's missing?
The nucleus?
Right. Red blood cell does not have a nucleus. Very good. It's just a biconcave disc that all it does is carry oxygen. So I'm not really concerned with the size of the cells, because we're not in the lab. But you have to know what shapes they are. I think shapes are going to be your big key, telling me what different tissues are. Again, you can go through this showing you pictures of cells. I have to get to the membrane though. And this is viewed different shapes, what they could look like. And we're going to go through all of that, so I don't have to spend too much time now. So here, now we got to talk. Now we have to talk. So all cells, I can't think of one that does not have a plasma membrane. And of course, it forms an outer barrier. But it's going to say this many times, but our plasma membrane, this you have to pay attention to. Plasma membrane is what we call selectively permeable. Some books say semi-permeable, but I like selectively permeable. Permeable means things going in and out, like a screen or a sieve or a filter. So permeate means going through something. So selective means what is it going to allow to go in or out, right? So what do we have? Let's just talk about this. What are some things that can go in and out of cells? Remember the molecules. Think of a molecule. What's that inorganic
Maybe
molecule?
water?
Actually, I would say that would be the first thing I would say. Beautifully said. Water, sodium, potassium, right? Glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, hormones like testosterone, growth hormone. Now, testosterone goes in the cell. Growth hormone really doesn't get in, but it makes a change. But these are really important, these kind of things. And also calcium. But water especially. But water is very unique. Our body loves water in general. Our bodies are about 69 to 70% water. All our fluids, mostly water. Inside our cell, mostly water, right? So this plasma membrane is really important because it's selectively permeable. It has some outer things like Might as well remember this now. Let's get this down now. Cilia are proteins on the outer side of the cell, outside the membrane, and that's for movement. Like in your respiratory tract. Our respiratory epithelial cells, they secrete a lot of mucus, as you probably know. So cilia helps move that mucus. But cilia is in other cells, not just the respiratory, it's in the reproductive, it's in the digestive system, to move things along. Not to move the cell, to move substances along, like an oocyte or sperm or mucus or dust or bacteria, COVID-19. It moves it along, get it out. It's a line of defense sometimes, as in the case of bacteria, dust, and viruses. Flagellum is like a huge cilia. That's like a swimmer. That's like for swimming. I'll just say swimming. So what cell in our body, not everybody's body, just the guys, is mostly using that tail to swim? And the tail is called flagella. Flagellum singular. What cell swims?
Sperm.
Yeah, sperm cell. So that's really the only place we see flagella. Now, bacteria, they use a lot of flagella, but we're a little bit more complex than bacteria. Not much, but a little bit. Now, so cilia was for movement. Flagella is a huge protein cilia for swimming. Locomotion, really is the word. Microvilli is for absorption. So remember we went to Popeyes and we ate the carbohydrates, we ate the proteins, we ate the lipids, the triglycerides. So our digestive system is going to break down those carbs, proteins, and lipids into the smallest products. Like carbohydrates, of course, would be glucose. Proteins would be amino acids. And the lipids would be fatty acids. Okay, or cholesterol. There's another basic building block of a steroid, which is also a lipid, which is hydrophobic and non-polar. So microvilli line the epithelial cells of our small intestine that absorbs things like amino acids, glucose, fatty acids, but also it absorbs vitamins, right? Certain vitamins are reabsorbed. You have your sodium could be reabsorbed there. Your calcium is reabsorbed there. We need calcium for blood homeostasis, building our bones, and a lot of other things. We got to talk about calcium later. Okay, so absorption is done through these microvilli, just to remember that. All cells have a nucleus except for two. One you just told me was the red blood cell, does not have a nucleus. It's anuclear. So all cells have nuclei. And platelets don't have nuclei either. Okay, so it's usually the darkest staining histology or cytology you see on the microscope slide. And get this, the nucleus has its own membrane. It's called the nuclear envelope. And this is where DNA lives, in the nucleus. And there's fluid inside that membrane, nucleoplasm. I'll probably never ask you that, but this you have to know. So the area and substances and fluid between the plasma
Professor?
membrane and the nucleus is called the cytoplasm. So the
Sorry, I have a
cytoplasm,
question.
go ahead,
Did you say that all cells have a nucleus?
except two. What two don't?
Red blood cells?
And platelets, very good. Red blood cells,
Thank you.
platelets, no nucleus. Excellent question. So cytoplasm is between the nucleus and the plasma membrane. And there's the fluid part, which is called cytosol. That's the fluid. Organelles, we already told me, remember all those? And technically the nucleus is an organelle and the nucleolus is an organelle, but it's all the things within the cytoplasm. So the fluid portion of the cytoplasm is called cytosol. Inclusions you're going to see are like ribosomes and other things that aren't membrane bound. Okay, are you with me so far?
Yeah.
So let's say here's the cell membrane, right, of a cell. And this is very specialized. We're going to have to take a break before we do this. And then every cell except for the red blood cell and the platelet has a nucleus, and the nucleus contains DNA. It also contains a small structure called nucleolus. So the nucleus has a membrane. That's the nuclear membrane, which is also called the nuclear envelope. So between the membrane of the cell, the plasma membrane, and the nuclear envelope, all this is cytoplasm. So there's fluid in there, right? Are you with me? And that's called cytosol. But it's also called, get this word, I hope you understand this. Cytosol is also called intracellular fluid. So intra means within. And then let's say we have another cell, which of course in tissue you have cell. And sometimes, most of the time they're connected, but there's space in between. And here's another cell with a nucleus, a nucleus and the cytoplasm. So anything outside the cell, like here and here, right? Between cells, we call that intercellular fluid. So inter means between cells, like interstate highways go between states. Intercellular is between. And sometimes we call it extracellular fluid. Or another word for this is interstitial. That means in between the tissue. So some cells are a lot of cells are actually bound together tightly, but there's different junctions between cells. But the intercellular, interstitial all means the same thing, or extracellular fluid is between cells. So do you see there's like two compartments? There's an intracellular fluid compartment and there's a interstitial fluid compartment. Do you understand that? Because things are going to go in and out of cells between the fluid and the cytosol. And what's the barrier between those two? The plasma membrane. And then it gets even more complicated because you have blood, right? Blood vessels. Everybody knows a blood vessel, like a capillary. Let's say an oxygen is carried in the red blood cell. So oxygen, O2, goes into the interstitial fluid, and then it's got to get into the cell to get to the mitochondria to make what for energy? With glucose. Glucose is out here.
Make
ATP.
It makes ATP. You see how that works? So and if this could be a hormone too, but oxygen has to diffuse, which means going from a high concentration to a low concentration, which you're going to go into after the break. So O2, oxygen comes off the red blood cell, out of the blood. This is blood, not interstitial fluid. This is plasma, which is the liquid part of blood, and this blood cell is connective tissue, right? So oxygen goes into the interstitial fluid, goes into the cell, and then into the mitochondria, which is an organelle, membrane-bound organelle. Glucose doesn't really go into the mitochondria. It's kind of busted up and out here through glycolysis. And then the byproducts go into the mitochondria to make a whole boatload of ATP so they can help move things in and out of a cell if it needs energy, if it costs something. So the fluid compartments are very important. Extracellular fluid, intracellular fluid, which is also known as the cytosol, and the blood, like testosterone, right? Madison's going through puberty, right? His testosterone is going crazy, right? So testosterone is lipid soluble. Watch this. Testosterone, watch how this works. Testosterone goes into the interstitial fluid, walks right into the membrane. You don't even need a bouncer because he's lipid soluble. The membrane is mostly lipid. He walks right in, gets into the DNA. DNA sends a message to messenger RNA. Messenger RNA goes to the ribosome, starts busting out proteins, building muscle, building bone, anabolic. So these substances have to flow in and out of this selectively permeable membrane all the time. It happened, I can't even tell you how many times it happened while we're sitting here drinking coffee and recording lectures, right? So those are the three main parts. Now, the organelles we can go through one at a time. So the cytosol is intracellular fluid, and that's the fluid part of the cytoplasm, right? Of course, everything's high water content. I don't think there's any place where there's low water content where there's a fluid, except maybe the back of the eye. There's a vitreous humor. It's a little gelatinous. Cute little organs, organelles, right? So look at these macromolecules that are working in here. So you have membrane bound and non-membrane bound. I'm not going to split that here too much. Just going to go through it and see what these organelles are. Okay. Okay, just talking about different. Here's just, maybe it's easy to remember the non-membrane bound as everything else. I mentioned ribosome a lot. A ribosome is the site of protein synthesis. Cytoskeleton is the makeup of the cell, like the framework, structure. You know, a lot of proteins there. Cytoskeleton is the frame. Kind of gives the shell its the cell its shape. Centrosome is about making spindles from mitosis, and then proteasomes, which are really about cleaning up the cell, especially proteins that aren't used. So these are the ones we really, not everyone, but endoplasmic reticulum, which is rough and smooth, the Golgi apparatus, lysosomes, peroxisomes, mitochondria. They're all membrane bound. So they all have their own membrane. And also, of course, the nucleus has a membrane. Okay, and you have these inclusions. You have, this is an important word, glycogen. And glycogen is glucose storage. We store glucose as glycogen, as mammals. And it's in the liver and skeletal muscle. So glycogen is a polysaccharide. It's the human. So at Popeyes, we're eating the polysaccharide glycogen, right? And we break it down to glucose. Now, plants have cellulose, which we don't really digest. That polysaccharide, that's our fiber in our diet. But starch we can break down. So starch is plant storage of glucose. Glycogen is the mammal, us, storage of glucose. So pigments, really not that important for cells. Triglycerides, of course, within the cell, stored energy most of the time. So glucose, very important for energy, but that's why we need to store it. So when we need it, when our blood needs to elevate glucose, we'll break down glycogen. When we have too much glucose in our blood, we build up glycogen. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal, actually. Our body's really interested in glucose, getting glucose to our cells, really, to break it down, to make ATP. So here is this, and I'll probably put a picture of this on an exam. It's kind of easy. This is like 7th grade biology. We just know the parts. And you should know general parts, general functions of it, but we got to deal with the membrane. So here's the membrane. It's a selectively permeable membrane, which I'm going to go into heavily. And this is showing, this is the Mercedes-Benz. This has all the options. Of course, not every cell, depending on its function. What tissue we're talking about. And not all cells have every one of these parts. Like only the sperm has the flagellum, the tail. Many cells have cilia, but not, of course, not all. Microvilli, remember, for absorption. Not everywhere, mostly in the small intestine, right? So this little thing in here, I don't see where the arrow is going. Here it is. It's called the nucleolus. So be careful with those two, like in lab. The nucleus is the bigger membrane bound. The nucleolus is inside. I'll tell you what the nucleolus does. It makes ribosomes and ribosomal RNA. Nucleoplasm is basically just the fluid within the nucleus. And the nucleus contains what? DNA. DNA stays in the nucleus. Okay, so the nuclear envelope, I don't know if it says it here, but the nuclear envelope has holes in it. And they're called, it might be somewhere, I just can't see it. They're called nuclear pores. So the ribosomes can go through there. The messenger RNA can go through there to go out of the nucleus to go to the ribosome. So the nucleus, again, that's the government. That's the control center. The nucleolus is the little ping pong ball inside that's making ribosomes. Now the next membranous, and it looks continuous with the nucleus, is the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Now it's rough, we call it the RAR if you want. It's studded with ribosomes. That's what makes it rough. And I told you before, what do ribosomes do? The site of protein synthesis. So what does the rough endoplasmic reticulum do? It's building proteins. Then you have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which is basically just outside the membrane of the rough. And the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, SER, is not making proteins. It's building carbohydrates, lipids, phospholipids, and steroids too. So then another membrane-bound organelle is the Golgi apparatus. Now the Golgi apparatus is like the post office of the cell. And that's packaging these macromolecules, amino acids, glucose, carbohydrates, steroids, lipids. And it's preparing them to be sent out to other places in the cell or maybe out of the cell. Okay? And then you have these lysosomes. I like to talk about the lysosomes. They're really important in white blood cells. Like not every cell has lysosome, but most of them do. And lysosome is called the suicide sac of the cell. So lysosome releases enzymes that destroy things, engulfs, and eats like bacteria, viruses. So our white blood cells, like our lymphocytes and neutrophils, macrophages, like macrophages are cells. So you can hear this term. I just want to bring it up now. Macrophage is part of our immune system, our line of defense. It means big eater. Phage means to eat. So macrophage is in our tissue, and that is our line of defense if we get exposed to a bacteria or virus or parasite or something that's foreign to the body. So macrophages have, those cells have a lot of lysosomes. Peroxisome is about detoxifying, things like alcohol in your liver. I'm not going to talk much about that. So here's some ribosomes that are free ribosomes. They don't necessarily have to be bound to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. They could be free in the cytoplasm, in the cytosol. Centrosomes are what builds the spindles for cell division, mitosis. Proteasomes clean up faulty proteins or proteins that are in excess. There's too much in there. Cytoskeleton are proteins that build up the framework of the cell. Right, so look here, you're saying, this is a nice way they do this. Inside the cell is the cytosol. Outside is the interstitial fluid, also known as intercellular fluid, same thing, or extracellular fluid. The inclusions could be, like they said, they could be those triglycerides and pigments, right? Vesicles carry things. Like, remember the Golgi apparatus was the post office? Well, the packaging is usually in the form of a vesicle. And other chemicals can come in with vesicles, like neurotransmitters you're going to learn about with nerve cells, are stored and released in these little spaceships, little vesicles that carry things out of the cell membrane, selectively permeable membrane.
Sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
What does the Golgi apparatus like store exactly?
It doesn't really store anything. I think it's more of a packaging. It packages like, it takes like the amino acids and the proteins, and it packages them in vesicles to take them somewhere else, usually outside the cell. Carbohydrates, it's taking steroids, bringing that to other places. Like cholesterol, it's a whole city. So, but the Golgi apparatus kind of deals with all the macromolecules, whereas the rough endoplasmic reticulum is only building proteins. Smooth endoplasmic reticulum is not building protein, everything but. Like here, look at this vesicular. This is exocytosis. It's spitting out its contents. So whatever the Golgi apparatus made, like amino acids, it's going to spill it out into the interstitial fluid to go into another cell or go into the blood, the other compartment. So plasma membrane. And here's the mitochondria. Here's the mitochondrion cut in half. So that's a membrane. There's an inner membrane and an outer membrane, actually. So this is where the oxygen needs to go. And this is where ATP is made through the Krebs cycle or electron transport chain. So that's kind of a pretty good overview of the cell and what it does, right? So cells perform different functions. We have to go through all these functions when we go through different organs or different organ systems, which we're going to do. So again, the lab that you're going to do today is mostly about the plasma membrane, but I think in order to understand everything you're going to do, and there's a pre-lab in there, I don't think that's that helpful, so I'm not going to narrate that. So you could read it, it's good, but I think go by my PowerPoint that I'm narrating right now.